Janel Curry. I just want to welcome you into this session on history and philosophy of science. Our first speaker today is Stephen Contakes, who is going to speak on Genesis and Christian approaches to chemistry. And Stephen is from Westmont in the Department of Chemistry. So I will turn it over to Stephen, who will share his screen.
The title of my abstract mentioned Genesis and Christian approaches to chemistry. However, since I wrote that abstract, I realized that I wasn't going to stick to Genesis, that my talk will end up generating more questions than answers, and that would be a good thing anyway. So now my talk is called Questions and Christian Approaches to Chemistry. The first question is why we should care about a Christian approach to chemistry at all. In my own case, chemistry is not something that I chose to pursue as a distinctly Christian vocation, and I did not start thinking about what that might mean until it became clear that my calling involved helping students at a Christian college think about what it means to be a chemist of faith. Fortunately, my students were good at asking questions that I had been by then merely intuited the answers to. Questions like, why should I practice chemistry? Or, how does chemistry fit into God's plans again? Or, if I'm going to practice chemistry, how does my faith influence that? Why does it matter? And as I thought about the answers to those questions, those in turn led to some more questions. Even just the act of getting more specific sort of helped. So does Christianity sanction or allow or encourage chemistry became, does Christianity give us any reasons to value chemists' efforts to make stuff, measure stuff, or figure out how things work? Can I change the world one molecule at a time, or pursue technology, make better things for better living by making, say, pesticides or plastics, not just medicine and doing green chemistry? Could I figure out how to make molecules that will likely never find a practical use, likely never be used medicinally, might just help extend our knowledge of the world and how chemistry works? And even if I'm allowed to do these things, how can I practice chemistry well, responsibly and ethically, as one person in part of a larger system? Or another way to put that is, aren't social problems just somebody else's problem? And then how do I do that while limited in wisdom and foresight and susceptible to vices common to man? One possible starting point would be to say, what does the Bible teach about chemistry? How does the Bible fit in? How does it fit into the Bible story? And the short answer is it doesn't say anything about chemistry proper, but it has a lot to say about things related to chemistry. And the first of those things is it has a lot of things to say about what chemistry studies, matter, its properties and the changes that it undergoes. The Genesis creation account, unlike some philosophical systems, views matter as a good thing. The first Genesis creation account alone presents it as created by God, an object of God's care. It presents it as capable of change, development, and fruitfulness. It presents it as good, what we are made of, and the locus of God's encounter with dust-formed, God-imaging humans. Later on, other scriptures maybe flesh that out a little bit and clarify it and present matter as dependent on God, something that depends on, that it requires God for its continued existence. It presents it as chaotic within limits, right? The ordering is not complete. And importantly, it does not present it as something to be transcended, but an integral part of our spiritual lives. You see this in God's use of an earthly people living in a specific physical land, with God dwelling in their midst via a physical tabernacle, material offerings, and Jesus' own bodily incarnation, life, ministry, death, and resurrection, and ascension. You see it in material sacraments, emphasis on bodily holiness, and an expectation of bodily resurrection, a new heavens and a new earth, and a new city of God. And finally, the scriptures tell us that matter is not in the deepest sense for us, it is for Jesus Christ, the purpose of creation. So for the Christian, matter is not an afterthought, it matters, and it has a place. The Bible also gives us reasons to expect doing chemistry as a science, as a way of finding out things about the cosmos, and generating useful technologies to be worthwhile as well. Now, this topic has been addressed often well and elsewhere, so I'll only review with a few main reasons, and I'll largely follow Polkinghorne in the 1991 PSCF article. First, Christianity posits that creation is going to be to some extent ordered, which gives us reason to expect that matter is going to exhibit some level of orderly behavior, so that there's something for us to discover as we do science. Second, it tells us we're created in God's image, and in the bigger scriptural picture, that we have some intellectual capacity for relationship with God. So based on that, we might expect it to be possible for us to recognize the order and wisdom that God put in creation. And then next, we see that God is free in how God creates the universe. It's not, it doesn't have to be a certain way, but God was free to create it in the way that God did. Because of that, we shouldn't just do thought experiments or be armchair philosophers. We've got to get out there in the real world and do experiments to find out what creation is like. And to these, I would add that we're called to bring out creation's potentialities, to sort of order it the right way, and that as part of that calling, we should learn what the potentialities of material creation actually are. Finally, Christianity gives us reasons to handle matter well. In Genesis, this takes the form of the so-called culture mandate and stewardship mandate associated with our creation in God's image and the call to fill, subdue, and replenish creation. While the exact meaning of what it means that we are created in God's image is a little bit debated, in the Genesis creation account we're given several clues for what it might mean about how we interact with creation. Specifically, we're told that God cares for the material creation, in part using the imagery of God's Spirit hovering over the waters. And incidentally, that's the same hovering used to describe God's caring for Israel in Deuteronomy 32, which in turn might have been the passage Jesus was echoing when he spoke of himself as behaving towards Jerusalem like a mother hen gathering her chicks. So it's quite a bit of care. Another aspect of this care is reflected in how God set up ordering the formless and void creation to make it good. And interestingly, God is presented as doing this through speaking in a process that we sometimes take to involve a coercive command. However, since we read things like, let the waters bring forth and let the earth bring forth, a better way might be to look at it as a call for creation to bring forth what God gave it the potential to be. From this vantage point, imaging God might involve our acting as co-creators or sub-creators who care for creation by ordering it in ways that reflect God's good intentions for it, by inducing it to become what God gave it the potential to be. Now, that may not only involve chemistry, but it certainly sounds a lot like chemistry at what at its best is supposed to be. But that is not all. The same passage calls us to steward the creation God made and owns, first, everywhere, in fruitful prevalence by being fruitful and multiplying, and second, as benevolent viceroys, bringing creation under control and governing it in ways that demonstrate God's care for creation. So not only could imaging God involve doing things like chemistry, we're given some general tasks that we might want to make stuff, measure stuff, and figure out how things work in order to do well. Now, based on that simple read of the culture and stewardship mandates, you might expect that chemists should work on projects related to fertility and environmental stewardship. However, the rest of the Bible also helps us by fleshing out what the culture and stewardship mandates might look like. For example, the Old Testament as a whole seems to value wisdom, including wisdom about the workings of nature, for example, Solomon's wisdom, wisdom for its own sake and as a source of delight and awe in God's work. In the New Testament, we're told the natural world provides evidence of God's power and Godhead. In addition, a few chapters after the Genesis creation accounts, we are told about specific cultural activities that will later form important elements of things like worship and life with God. These are city building, animal husbandry, music, and metalworking. And in Genesis, these are all presented as coming from the line of Cain and his even more dubious descendant Lamech, an obvious indication that these activities can be done in problematic ways. Fortunately, throughout the Old Testament, we're also given specific instructions in the law, prophets, and wisdom literature about how to engage in some of these particular craft technologies. For example, it's quite clear the Israelites were familiar with metalworking and that metallurgical products like bronze had a place in its worship. However, they were not to fashion metal idols or be like the nations and trusting in things like iron chariots. Moreover, when one recognized that the Old Testament laws, like other ancient Near Eastern codes, were probably intended as a form of moral instruction rather than as legal codes in the modern sense, as a whole they can be taken as a guidebook for the wise practice of chemistry. This is also incidentally true of much of the moral teaching of Jesus in the Gospels, and indeed of how Jesus' life and ministry were applied to concrete situations by the writers of the New Testament. Of course, we need to be careful about how we extrapolate from the Old Testament law. At minimum, we'll need to take into account that we're in a different social position than the Old Testament Israelites, who were largely called to reflect God's character and how they lived in a land God gave them. And this, of course, poses the additional question of how we as Christians, who are called to function as sojourners, proclaiming the gospel in a pluralistic society and making disciples, are called to reflect God's characters with respect to things like our employers, our discipline or guild of chemistry, the nations of which we're a part, the entire world of which we're a part, and so forth, in the context of all that. At this point, you might be asking how this differs from any other aspect of Christian discipleship. The short answer is that it doesn't. So then why care about having a vision for chemistry at all? First, I don't think we should ever lose sight of the fact that God can guide us whether or not we have a biblical vision for our vocations. So in that sense, it really isn't a necessity. However, it is an opportunity, specifically for wonder and delight, a gracious opportunity to pursue God with our hearts through our minds. I personally view my own work of molecule making as an opportunity to reflect God's creativity and worshipfully enjoy the wonders of the molecular world. Second, it can also help us think well. In a general sense, it can keep us from viewing science and technology as the answer to all problems, a sort of universal savior of mankind. Simultaneously, it can keep us from jaded views in which scientists are playing God or opening technically sweet Pandora's boxes without a care for anyone else. Instead, we can see chemistry as helpful for our calling to enjoy God and caringly govern the world. A biblical perspective can also help us navigate practical day-to-day issues too. As an academic chemist at a teaching-heavy, predominantly undergraduate institution with a research program that is unlikely to radically transform society, at least other than through the students that I train, I don't worry too much about my work having an outsized impact on the world. Nevertheless, I have at times found it difficult to balance the seemingly endless needs in my department, college, family, students, church life, and other areas, to make good decisions about the sort of projects I work on, how I work with students, and things like that, and even some small decisions such as whether or not to pursue a patent for some of my work. I've also been conscious of how the culture at Westmont and the subtle moral pressures associated with academic life have shaped me and might be shaping my students. These are similar to the issues that Walter Hearn raised long ago in his essay, Whole People and Half-Truths. However, not all Christians in chemistry have had the same experience. Some might have the freedom and skill to pursue projects that dovetail nicely with enterprises that promote shalom and human flourishing, things like green chemistry and medical research. However, others might need to decide whether to work on projects more ambiguous in their relationship to human flourishing, perhaps things like consumer products, pesticides, or military work. Examples from recent history include the much caricatured German chemist Fritz Haber, the devil's chemist of the Holocaust, Louis Fieser's work on napalm, and the Dow napalm controversy. The latter is particularly interesting since it pitted a coalition of clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam against devoted Episcopal laymen running Dow, at least one of whom complained about how little the individualistic ethics discussed in Christian circles helped him think through the issues involved. If I have the opportunity, I plan on exploring that case next time as a way to drill down a bit more on what might be involved in living out a Christian vision for chemistry. Let me close by suggesting two ways to move these general ideas towards concrete frameworks that we might apply. First, we as chemists might do well to expand our reading and networking beyond the usual type of faith-learning books and people. In particular, it might be helpful for us to think about things like biblical ethics, social justice, and politics of culture and approaches to Christians influencing culture for good. We might also look at secular risk management principles and ethical documents like the Global Chemical Code of Conduct to see how much it might be a matter of putting those principles into concrete practice. A second way forward might be to develop a collection of real-world case studies similar to those addressed in the recently released volume on the ethics of chemistry. I think that these could serve as the basis for a discussion about what it really might mean to live out our Christian vocations in chemistry in a way that reflects sort of the story that God has for us and a biblical vision of flourishing. Now, I've been asked to suggest some resources for the journey, so here are some for you to consider. I'll leave them up as I start to take questions. In the meantime, thank you for your kind attention.
Hey, thank you, Stephen. We have time for a couple questions. Victoria?
So I was just wondering, what is your experience been among other chemists? Do many chemists that you come across have, concerns with conflicts between their faith and science, or have they brought those together, or what are your feelings on that?
Well, my experience has largely been that in America, chemists tend to think about this in terms of origins issues. And the other parts of what it means to be a scientist and how we live out our faith in science, they either haven't thought about or is just some kind of big unanswered question. Or like in my own case, you just trust that the normal processes of Christian discipleship will kind of take care of that. And I think that that's not a terrible approach, but like you see in the Dow napalm controversy and a few other cases where we have evidence of how people are thinking, at some level that breaks down. Like you really need concrete tools to help think through issues that go beyond individualistic sort of moral choices of day-to-day life, or to even see your work in a bigger context and how what you do might be contributing to a culture and ways of thinking about and acting in the world.